It was a matter of chance that I should have rented a house in one of the strangest communities in North America. It was on that slender, riotous island which extends itself due east of New York, and where there are, among other natural curiosities, two unusual formations of land. 20 miles from the city, a pair of enormous eggs, identical in contour and separated only by a courtesy bay, jet out into the most domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere, the great wet barnyard of Long Island Sound. The Jazz Age was a time of degraded values and increased materialism. A radio in every living room and 2 cars in every garage. Due to the booming economy, there was a dramatic increase in new wealth. The Great Gatsby was a study of the conflict in values between new money and old money, with Jay Gatsby representing the growing number of people who have more money than they know what to do with. Fitzgerald found the best possible place to set his book, with people like Gatsby and Great Neck to the west, and established families like the Buchanans in Port Washington to the east. Port Washington is touted as a quaint little harbor town on Long Island, with good schools, high property values, and a growing population. But a very unconventional Sands Point resident named Peter Mohan offers a very different perspective on the town. In his opinion, he's living on the land, and everyone else is just building around him.
I know a fair bit about Sands Point, actually. It's changed tremendously, as I'm sure you know, even in my lifetime. And I've been a resident of Port Washington since approximately 1972. So what are we talking about? 35 years in Port Washington. But I grew up in Manhasset, the next town over, so I've been around here all my life, and I know a bit about the peninsula here. And I guess the main thing to say about Port Washington is how much change it's gone through.
This is Middle Neck Road, the central axis of Sands Point. It's hard to imagine that just over 100 years ago it was a dirt trail for horses and carriages. All the way at the end of this road is the northmost point of the peninsula. This is prime real estate, filled to the brim with mansions and featuring a beautiful view of New York City. The earliest whites to settle in Port Washington were Dutch men and women who were escaping the restrictive Puritanism of New England. The earliest settlers included the Sands, the Motts, the Dodges, the Hewletts, and the Onderdonks. They were all attracted to the natural beauty and bountiful resources that the peninsula boasted in the 1600s. From Hempstead Harbor to Manhasset Bay, the villagers set up a small farming and grazing community. Back in the 1600s, this peninsula was known as Cow Bay.
It's called Cow Bay because the peninsula offered the opportunity with one strand of fence along the southern end of the peninsula, between Hempstead Harbor. The peninsula is bracketed on the east by Hempstead Harbor and on the west by Manhasset Bay. And they're separated at the base at the southern end of the peninsula by about a 3.5-mile stretch of land. And somebody determined in the colonial era that if they put a fence across connecting those two bays, they would trap all the cows on the peninsula. And so for many years, the peninsula was used to graze beef cattle and sheep, because all they had to do was maintain one line of fence, and they had access to tens of thousands of acres to feed cattle. And so there was actually what you would have to associate with a Wild West type cattle roundup operation. People would merely start at Sands Point and bang drums and pots and pans and whatever, shoot pistols, and move south until they'd herded every piece of livestock.
In 1647, the cattle population of Cow Neck was the same as the human population, 300 of each.
The name was changed to Port Washington following the Revolutionary War, because General Washington made his famous tour of Long Island, and the Onderdonk House and the George Washington Inn, which I'm sure had, so I think it was an Onderdonk mill But it got changed to the Washington Manor literally after George Washington slept here.
In the early 1700s, people began moving in from all over. John Cornwell and his wife Mary, tired of Indian attacks, came down from Rhode Island to Soundview right on Manhasset Bay, where they were appointed land by a British governor. The landholders of the town of North Hempstead protested. They didn't want outsiders building property on communal grazing land. Some of the villagers dressed up as Indians and burned the Cornwells' house to the ground. The culprits were caught and fined for their crime, and the Cornwells built a new house on the same spot, which stands to this day. By the 1800s, several new industries were introduced to the peninsula, amongst them sand, gravel, and oyster farming.
Manhasset Bay, which is named not for an Indian tribe, but for an Indian word, meaning island of sand. The island of sand is now gone, as is all the sand in Port Washington. But Manhasset Bay, a local body of water, the next harbor over actually, is famous for two things. One would be the sand that they provided for the concrete for basically the building of New York City. The largest sand mining operation in the world took place here for almost 100 years. They extracted every cubic yard of pure glacial sand that the peninsula had to offer, and it all turned into high-quality concrete. It was specified in many contracts in New York City because of its quality. During the robber baron era, it was selected as a suitable location for the grandness of Castle Gould, the Guggenheim estate, the Harriman estate. Governor Harriman lived out here. His family, a long history here of great wealth and great political power, and how they made their fortune I don't really know. But the Astors were here, the Vanderbilts were here, the Fricks were here. A lot of famous people were here, and they were also across the harbor in Glen Cove and in Kings Point as well. It was part of the Gold Coast, a big part of the Gold Coast, and those castles are still standing, of course, and they belong to Nassau County, and now they're sort of run as parks.